Começa agora, Jovem Pan Morning Show.
Jovem Pan Morning Show.
Good morning, Jovem Pan viewers and listeners. Today we're honored to be joined in São Paulo by none other than Dr. Jordan Peterson, internationally acclaimed Canadian scholar and educator whose life has been and is a continuing epic. His profound journey through the depths of psychology, religion, and cultural criticism has established him as one of, if not the most influential thinker of our time. A former Harvard professor and a long-standing figure at the University of Toronto, Dr. Peterson first captured global attention with his seminal work, Maps of Meaning, where he explored how belief systems shape our perceptions of the world. His exploration deepened with the biblical series, bringing ancient stories to life through a modern psychological lens. His best-selling books, 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order, have sold millions worldwide and amassed a legion of fans, not only in Brazil, but very much beyond, guiding individuals through the complexities of modern existence with rules that champion personal responsibility and meaning. Beyond his writings, Dr. Peterson's life is anchored by his family, his wife Tammy, his daughter Michaela, son Julian, and grandkids Elizabeth Scarlett, and most recently Elliot, grounding his theoretical explorations in the realities of everyday life. So as Dr. Peterson joins us for his very first interview with a Brazilian audience during his We Who Wrestle with God tour, we're absolutely honored to delve into his insights and experiences, because his work is not only challenging for us to think, but also to act with intent and integrity in our own lives. But before we start, please like this video, subscribe to our morning show channel, where we're about to finally hit our 2 million subscriber mark, and please share this interview around the world. That's our message. So before we start, like an ancient sailor guided by the stars, if you will, we're both awed and eager as we take on this personal and I hope very educational conversation. So welcome to Brazil, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you very much.
Such an honor. Thank you so very much, and to this moment of profound exploration. So this is very exciting. I cannot suffice it to say, right? But there's this broad swath of Brazilians who might be hearing this broadcast right now, and they might be going through on their everyday environments. They might be sitting in local bakeries. They might be at a stop during lunch at work, and they might still not have had the privilege to have contact with your work. I know this was perhaps a thorough introduction, but what brings you to Brazil at this point, and what does your Brazilian fan base mean to you in the more broader sense?
Well, what brings me here is a continuation of the things that you quite comprehensively described in that introduction. An examination of the cardinal role that individuals play in determining the destinies of their own lives, the lives of their families, but also more broadly, the lives of the direction of their society and even the world more broadly beyond that. I mean, it's a cardinal insistence of the Judeo-Christian world review that each person stands in some mysterious way at the center of things. And I believe that's true. I think it's true psychologically. I think it's true technically. It's true philosophically and theologically, and it needs to be understood. Not just accepted as an idea, but understood. And that will mean acted out. And so what I'm doing with my wife and my crew on the We Who Wrestle with God tour is promoting my next book, which is called We Who Wrestle with God, which deals with the ideas that I just discussed in a biblical context.
Worldwide release on November
19th is when it's coming out.
All right.
And so this is a very early tour, obviously, but that's fine. And we're engaged in the attempt to bring the biblical stories to life. And what does that mean? It means to help people understand them conceptually, to appreciate their message in a manner that's understandable, but to make of that understanding something that's actually applied in the way they look at the world and conduct their lives. There's a very practical element to it, the most practical element, I would say.
I think we couldn't have a better segue into our next question, because In your work addressing humanity's vast concerns, you often touch upon the fundamental battle between good and evil. And with global population recently surpassing 8 billion, most of them from lower to middle socioeconomic backgrounds, there is a universal struggle in terms of their life's steering wheels, if you will, the sum of our values, our dreams, our endeavors. These steering wheels guide us through the troubles that we encounter in life, the pebbles and boulders in our shoes. But as we grapple with these challenges, high concepts coming from authors you often cite and have inspired you so much, like Jung, Nietzsche, C.S. Lewis, often seem quite abstract and far from having from the everyday realities of these people I'm talking about. So how can we make such philosophical insights, Doctor, more tangible and more actionable by these people?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. That is the trick. Well, it's I suppose it's part of the universal responsibility of the educated, of the truly educated, to join heaven and earth, so to speak. And what that means, that's always been the role, for example, of shaman, going back 150,000 years or longer than that, is to unite the divine and the practical. The idea, the Jack and the Beanstalk story is an illustration of that, for example, of the construction of this tree, the tree of life, that unites the realm of abstraction, the heavenly realm, with the practical and the concrete. You see this as well in the story of Christ. That's where it's most clearly delineated. So there's an insistence in Christianity that what Christ represents, so that's the Logos, is the creative force that existed at the beginning of time and that is constantly operating. So you could think about that as the force akin to consciousness that confronts the potential of the world and that generates the order that is good or very good. That's the portrayal in Genesis 1. That's the image of man as well. And so that's what we're called upon to do. That's the divine Logos, that's the Alpha and the Omega. It's there at the beginning, it operates now, and it's there indefinitely into the future. It characterizes the structure of reality itself. The idea of the incarnation of the Word is the union of that with a very specific time and place. So there's a mystery. It's quite well portrayed in a famous movie in the 1970s called Jesus Christ Superstar, where the figure of Judas sings a song about Christ and asks what possible purpose God might have in bringing the hypothetical Savior of the world into embodied form in Nazareth, of all places, this misbegotten town, famous for nothing, in the middle of the desert, essentially, in a time where there's no mass communication. Why then? And the answer is something like, well, it doesn't matter when or where, because the Logos is something that's incarnated in everyone, and everyone, like Christ, in some ways stands at the center of the world. So the Savior, in principle, is born as in a lowly form in the manger, right, among the animals, as in as unprivileged a condition as you could possibly imagine, threatened with death, to a mother who at the moment is of dubious reputation in a family that has its structural problems, and yet matures and grows up to be the hero that redeems. That's the story of, in principle, of every individual. And followers of Christ in that regard, and bearers of the Middle Eastern and then Western tradition, are called upon to realize that in their own lives and to understand that that's actually a story about them, as unlikely as that might seem. And you might say, well, why is there any reason to believe that? And I would say, well, consider the alternatives to believing that. So free cultures are predicated on the idea that each person is a locus of divine worth. And that's associated with this web of ideas we just discussed. The alternative to that is to treat people like they're deterministic robots or that their value can be inferred as a consequence of their comparative social status or their prowess. And if you treat people like they're deterministic robots, try that on your wife and see how well that goes for you. Or try it on your children or on yourself. No one responds to that well. We all want to be treated as if what we perceive matters and what we say is important and how we conduct ourselves is relevant. And if you treat people like that, they flock to you. And if you don't, they want to have nothing to do with you. And so that's like an existence proof of the necessity for that doctrine of radical value. And if you treat people like they're only dependent on their social status, then you're kind of a psychopathic social climber. No one, again, is going to want to be around you because you'll kiss up and kick down. And if you organize your society on that principle, it'd just be a dynamic between tyrant and slave. And so, do we believe that each person is a locale of divine worth? Well, we believe that people have intrinsic rights, and we believe that the societies that we want to live in, and we can see the evidence for that, shape themselves in accordance with that belief. And so we believe it insofar as we act it out, regardless of what we say we believe. We see this in more recent occurrences. So, for example, the world's most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, came out 2 weeks ago and said that he was a cultural Christian. Well, you know, well, right, that begs a question. It's like, I see the Christians got something right, did they? Let's say compared to the alternatives, about which Dawkins will barely even speak. What did they get right?
Wasn't it G.K. Chesterton who once said that the test of a good religion is how far you can critique it, or something along those lines?
Right.
Isn't that the ultimate testament to the tolerance that Christian
that's a good question.
Purpose?
That's a reasonable point, and it's certainly a reasonable question, and I'm certain that it's one that Dawkins would be inclined to agree with. Right. Can you criticize it? And obviously, in Christian societies, by and large, criticism of Christianity is not only allowed but encouraged. There are exceptions to that, but if you compare the history, the track history of Christianity in that regard with the track history of virtually any other creed or ideology that you can possibly conceive of, it comes across quite nicely.
Stands the test of time, right?
By all appearances, yes.
But still delving a little deeper into the biblical stories you'll be bringing to us on your upcoming book, much anticipated, reflecting on Genesis chapters 2 and 3 back to the story of Adam and Eve. I believe it's a story which its fundamental theme is about rebellion against divine order, if you will. And so what parallels do you see between the story of Adam and Eve and current societal shifts, especially in how young people today challenge established norms?
So, back in the mid to late 1800s, the German philosopher Nietzsche famously announced that God was dead. And he said, furthermore, that we had killed him. That was the greatest murder that had ever occurred, and that we'd be fortunate indeed if we could find enough water to wash away the blood. And then he predicted that epidemic of nihilism and false utopianism would flood the world in consequence. And that's all true. He got that dead right. What Nietzsche didn't know was that sort of thing had happened many times before in the past, that this wasn't a unique occurrence. It wasn't the Enlightenment rebellion against God that was only characteristic of Western society. The death of God is a recurrent motif. It was very well documented by the Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, and it follows a pattern. In any case, Nietzsche's proposed medication for that death was that human beings would have to rise up to the point where they could create their own values. Now, there's two things that are wrong about that. The first is, as you pointed out, that's exactly the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, is that they are tempted by the spirit of Lucifer in the form of the serpent to presume that they can generate the moral order to themselves, that they can incorporate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and that they can now structure the world entirely in accordance with their will. That produces the fall. You could think about it this way in your own life. You could think, prideful overreach produces unnecessary suffering. Or you could even say it more simply, beware of biting off more than you can chew. And that is exactly what Adam and Eve do. And that metaphor of inappropriate consumption is part of the underlying symbolic structure of the story. God's insistence to Adam and Eve at the beginning of the story is that human beings are allowed to interact with the garden that's their home, the walled garden, the balance between order and nature that's their home. They can interact with anything in it, and they can do anything they want except to take that final step. And that's what Eve is tempted to do, and that's what Adam follows her in doing. And that's what produces the suffering and even the death that then characterizes the fallen world. So what's the parallel in the modern world? Well, we do believe presumptuously that there is no implicit or divine order, and we do believe presumptuously, especially if we're intellectual, that we can recast man, society, nature, and God in the image that our own intellect is prone to worship.
Yep.
And all that produces is hell. And so, well, then the question arises, well, what's the alternative to that? And, well, the biblical corpus is actually an examination of the appropriate alternative. So, I'll give you an example of that. So,
Please do.
the Bible is an analysis of the pattern of sacrifice that's acceptable to God. Right? So that's Abel's pattern of sacrifice, say, contrasted with Cain's. And so, the idea of sacrifice is the idea upon which the community itself is based. This is something Christianity and the Jews before that got dead right. Sacrifice is the basis of community. Okay, why? Well, because if you're going to live with other people, if you're going to have friends, if you're going to have a wife or a husband, if you're going to have business partners, if you're going to live in a town, it can't be all about you. You have to give something up that is in your narrow self-interest in order to establish harmonious relationships with everyone else. So community itself is a sacrificial process. Okay, so, and that's clear. Like, it doesn't take much thought to understand that. When you socialize children, they have to give up their temper tantrums. They have to give up the immediacy of their desires in order to become acceptable as friends and more mature individuals. When you get married, you have to give up other women in relationship to your wife and vice versa. When you become a father, you have to give up that narrow and immediate personal freedom that characterized you as a bachelor to take a more mature and longer term view of your social surround and the future. And so the community is dependent on sacrifice, and maturity itself is a sacrificial process. Okay, so once you understand that, another question arises, which is, well, if sacrifice is necessary, then what is the optimal sacrifice? And the biblical story develops a representation of the optimal sacrifice. You see it in the story of Abraham. Abraham is called upon to sacrifice everything to God, including his son. Right, which is a very dramatic incident, and the atheist types point to that as the cruelty of God, but they don't. There's something they don't understand. They're missing.
Which is?
You have to offer your children as sacrificial lambs to the world in order for them to both mature and for you to even remain in contact with them. So the psychoanalysts, who were good critics of the Nietzschean presumption, by the way, they pointed out very early, the Freudians, that the good mother had to fail. So what does that mean? Well, if you're the mother of an infant, you protect the infant in every possible way from any sort of damage, and the infant really has no responsibility in that regard. But as the infant matures, say into a toddler and then into a child and an adolescent, the mother has to let go and let the world do its best and its worst to the child. That's a sacrificial gesture. You see this, for example, it's a very famous...
This is quintessential Freudian doctrine.
Absolutely.
Winnicott as well plays into that.
That's right. That's right. They knew this. That's why the Freudians were so leery of the Oedipal mother who overprotects and devours. Well, the alternative is a sacrifice. So there's a famous statue in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Michelangelo. It's the Pieta, and so it's Mary, and Mary is seated, very beautiful and serene, and her son, Christ, is an adult, and in her arms, dead, broken, and she's offering that. That's a good way of thinking about it. Well, what does it mean? It means the good mother offers her child to be broken by the world. And that's right. And that's a sacrificial gesture. So you see, part of the ultimate sacrificial gesture is the offering even of your children upward. Now you remember in the story of Abraham, Abraham is called upon by God to sacrifice Isaac, but because he is willing to do so, he doesn't have to. And so that's a very interesting twist too, because partly what it means is that if you're willing to let your children go and develop and mature, they'll return to you.
Sure.
Instead of running from you and being lost. And so you offer and you get back in consequence. So half of the sacrificial offering is son, and the other half is self. And those come together in the Christian passion, right? Because Christ is the son who's offered, but also the man who completely sacrifices himself to the community. Right, so the Christians got that dead right.
Dr. Peterson, I don't know if you also saw this, but I recently came across this scene of young Japanese infants. They're being stimulated by their own mothers to leave their own homes, go into the markets, grab groceries, and return home.
Right.
And
there's a TV series that's documenting that. Yes.
All right.
Yeah. It's like free-range children.
We were very impressed because in Brazil, there's this much paternalistic sense in trying to protect your kids at every turn, at every point, if you have the means to do so.
Yeah.
And I mean, once I'm not going to wear, I mean, just trying to paint this or try to relativize this. I had definitely a privileged background. I went to the best schools here in Brazil. And it was commonplace for us to go with bulletproof cars into schools. And it was a permanent sense of urgency, and in order not to be the next victim within Brazilian widespread violence that has been characterizing Brazilian streets and urban life for so long.
Yeah.
But I digress.
Well, somewhat you digress. I mean, this is actually one of the dangers of wealth.
Yeah.
You know, wealth deprives people of necessity.
Yep.
And that's a form of entrapment, and it can produce, exactly as you implied, it can produce what you're seeing all across the West, which is the hyper-dependence of over-sheltered children. And that's not good. So here's another way of thinking about it.
Please.
Well, there's a serpent in the garden, right? What does that mean? It means that even God himself can't make a structured space that doesn't have some outside danger in it. Okay, so then you might ask, well, what's the medication for the eternal serpent? And you could say, well, we could just get rid of all the serpents. No threat. Or you could say, no, we could train everyone to handle snakes. Right? Now, Christ makes allusion to that in the Gospels when he says that his followers will become wise handlers of serpents, and people take that literally. But what it means is that it's exactly what it means if you're a good father. Are you going to wrap your children in styrofoam and store them somewhere safe in the basement so that nothing ever could possibly harm them? Or are you going to train them to dance even with danger so that you can send them out into the world where they can have their adventure and prevail?
The latter.
Well, right, so then you could see that there's something that's very useful to realize about that, because people bemoan the cruelty of the world, the unfair suffering that characterizes the world, and fair enough, because the world is definitely a vale of tears. But by the same token, what we want for our children isn't safety at all cost. We want them to be able to wrestle with the catastrophe of the world and to prevail. And we decide in our deepest spirit that encouraging your children to become competent wrestlers of dragons is much better than protecting them. And so you can extend that up into the idea of the divine itself. It's that what God wants for us is to be the people who can contend with death and malevolence and prevail. And that's an adventure. That's
sure.
an adventure. So
most definitely it is. But Dr. Peterson, I mean, in a world full of what I would call the modern day serpents, if you will, that always tempt us with the proverbial apples, who do you believe are today's serpents in modern society? And what strategies can the masses employ to unite and resist and resist being fragmented by these few?
I think it's at a certain level of analysis, it's always the same old story. The medieval Christians did a pretty good job of laying out the landscape of sin. So, well, what tempts us? Well, pride for sure.
Sure.
We celebrate pride, as a matter of fact, right? We devote a substantial amount of time and resources to the celebration of pride.
For sure.
Everyone thinks that's kind of a, what would you say, that use of language is, well, not serious. That isn't really what it means. And I think, no, that's pretty much exactly what it means. Pride, we celebrate hedonism as well, especially on the sexual front, but with our celebration of materialism in general. And that's a bad idea, not least because if you worship hedonism and you celebrate pleasure, you destroy the source of pleasure itself. It doesn't work. So I'll give you an example of that. The people who have the most sex now are religious married people. Right, so that's a very comical end to the sexual revolution.
With all due respect, by the way, you mentioned in a recent interview you had with Michaela, your daughter, that the most important ingredient for a successful marriage these days is wild sex, wasn't it? That was sort of tongue-in-cheek, I guess, but you said it. Your words, my friend.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was a good joke for Michaela, but it's also not a joke, and it also reflects something very fundamental, is that the sexual revolution promised constant orgastic satisfaction to everyone who, no matter who they might be. And there's a story in Revelation, it's a very interesting story, an image. It's an image of the end of time. And it has two components. One component is the scarlet beast, and the scarlet beast is blood-colored, and it's patriarchal, it's male. It has multiple heads. And so what it represents is the masculine social world, the patriarchy, when it degenerates. Okay, so a society that's well-structured and a psyche that's well-structured should be a unity. Okay, when that unity falls apart, so when God dies, when that unity falls apart, you get something with many heads because it's confused. Okay, that's the degenerate patriarchal state. And it's blood-colored because that's the precursor to a further degeneration into the chaos that destroys everything. So that's the scarlet beast of the state. That's the degeneration of the masculine. Okay, on top of that, in this image, which is an image of the end of times, you have the whore of Babylon. Okay, in the biblical text, Babylon is the hedonistic tyranny. That's really what it stands for. And the whore of Babylon is a woman, a beautiful woman, attired in materialistic costuming in gold, holding a cup full of the liquids of her fornication. It's a very dramatic image.
Liquids of her fornication.
Yes, it's a very dramatic and horrifying image. But what she represents is if the masculine deteriorates, so does the feminine. And when the feminine deteriorates, it commodifies sexuality. That's the hallmark of the deteriorated feminine, the commodification of sexuality. You see that now with the incredibly widespread dispersion of pornography, about 30% of internet traffic, something like that. And so, and of course, when the security that marriage, monogamous marriage, and an integrated male state, when that disappears, one of the tempting pathways for women is the commodification of sexuality. Okay, so that's an end time image. The feminine deteriorates and the masculine. There's a kicker, though. The beast kills the prostitute. So what that implies is that the degenerate masculine state offers hedonistic pleasure as an enticement to slavery and then kills the source of pleasure itself. And that's exactly right. We see that because what's happening is that as the sexual revolution progressed and hedonism ruled, sex itself started to vanish. So 30% of Japanese young people under the age of 30 are virgins, right? And many, many people across the West.
What's the figure?
30%.
Is that right?
Yes. Yes, and
Holy moly.
it's not only Japan. You see the same pattern in South Korea. And they're only like 10 years ahead of the West in general on the developmental curve.
What would you attribute that to fundamentally?
I don't think that sex can sustain itself in the absence of a monogamous framework.
Yep.
Well, this is also what you see reflected in the fact that it's married religious couples who have the most sex. It's like we don't know. Sex is a complicated business. And it's as complicated as survival, right? Reproduction and survival, those are the two big challenges. And the idea that sex can be handled simply as a matter of mere momentary pleasure, there's no reason to assume that's true. Now, that was the promise of the sexual revolution, but it's now 60 years since the sexual revolution, and we can see that it's not delivering on its promises. Quite the contrary. It's destroying what it set out to free.
Doctor, if I may, I mean, I don't want to sound facetious here, but there's this very old joke here in Brazil that basically marriage is where sex goes to die.
Yeah, well, the statistical...
Wouldn't that be a contradiction?
Yeah, but it's not true.
It's not true.
No, well, that's the thing, is that the empirical data show very clearly that that's not true. Is
Great.
that it is literally now that religious married couples are having the best sexual lives. And so, and, you know, it might even be under those conditions that sexual life is rarely optimal. But then you should ask yourself, too, why should it be any less difficult to optimize your sexual life than it is to optimize anything else that you do? It's a very difficult thing to manage. Now, you might say, well, it's even more difficult to manage in a monogamous relationship. It's like, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever for that claim. Most dating people are not... Most people's solution to the dating problem is to find someone and quit dating. And the reason for that is because the dating life is not preferable to having the partner that you want.
Yep.
And you might say, well, there's still problems if you have the partner you want. It's like, well, you're probably the problem.
Let's see if I'm accurate here then, Doctor, because I believe so, considering what you said, that we perhaps have sunk into a depth where marriage, in a strange way, has become sort of countercultural or hip or sexy again, going against the grain, or going against the current prevailing winds.
Yes.
To get married has become sexy again, if
yes. No, I think
Would
that's
you concur?
right.
Would you concur?
And I think that's also the case for having children. I think what you'll see, look,
I'll get there.
The upper class never stopped being married.
Oh yeah.
Right. So when we pulled the rug out from underneath the institution of monogamous, long-term monogamous, religious-centered partnering, what happened was marriage died from the bottom of the economic hierarchy upward, but it never died at the stratosphere. And that's because the virtue-signaling aristocrats are perfectly happy to talk and to promote like a hedonistic individualism, but when it comes to themselves and their own children, none of that goes.
Speaking of them, they're very much present here in Brazilian elite circles for sure. The virtue signaling aristocrats. I like that expression.
But, well, they see the thing about, that's the luxury belief idea. The thing about the aristocrats,
they're derided sometimes as Bollinger, Bolsheviks, limousine liberals, if you will.
Right.
That's sort of
well, they can...
the caviar left.
Exactly. They can afford to have the... They can afford to promote the irresponsible hedonistic virtues because they don't pay a price for doing it. The people who pay a price are the people... The farther you go down on the socioeconomic ladder, the more people pay a price for the idiot hedonistic whims of the aristocrats. There's the old saying, when the upper class gets a cold, the lower class dies of pneumonia. And that's exactly right. So when you destabilize the social order, you don't free the serfs. You just abandon them to like an anarchic desert. And one of the things we will see happening, and I can see it already starting, is that committed monogamy with children will become fashionable again among the elite. That's already happening, and that'll spread down the hierarchy.
Down.
Yeah,
Right.
you can see that happening
Dr.
already.
Peterson, I believe it was Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher from the Renaissance, who said once that society needs to rediscover God periodically. And most recently, along in the same vein, we had a very astute comment coming from none other than Joe Rogan, who I believe is your friend at this point, who's a pragmatic guy. He's a humble guy.
Oh, yes.
He doesn't pretend to be someone who he isn't.
Yeah.
And he said, quote, like, if he came back now, it would be great, referring himself, of course, to Jesus. And he went on to say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, Jesus, if you're thinking about coming back, perhaps now is a good time.
Yeah,
now it's a good
right.
time. We're kind of fucked. Sorry for my French. Pardon my French. So do you believe such a time for such a discovery has come, and what would that entail?
So you're going to ask a simple question, are you? It's always the case, mythologically speaking, that the hero is born at the darkest moment. That's why we put Christmas around December 21st, right? When the sun disappears most intensely. And the birth of Christ is commensurate with the rebirth of the sun. The chaos of the darkness calls out the necessity of the hero, right? So in the ancient Egyptian creation story, the god of the state, Osiris, is overthrown by his evil brother, who cuts him into pieces and distributes him everywhere. Things fall apart. That's what that signifies. The goddess of chaos, Isis, makes her appearance and makes herself pregnant with the appropriate remains of Osiris. She gives birth to Horus. Horus is like King Arthur. Horus is like Simba in The Lion King. It's the same story. He grows up alienated from the state, like we all do. He's a falcon because he can see. And he can see evil. And so he goes back to Egypt and he has a terrible battle with his uncle and overthrows him. Whenever things are dire, that story repeats. Things degenerate into chaos. There's a fruitfulness about chaos. It gives rise to, it calls for the rebirth of the hero. And the hero makes himself manifest when things are darkest. And so, and often in the most unlikely places. Hence the manger, for example. Or you see that in the story of Moses, because he's a threatened Hebrew slave who's sentenced to death on the water, right? So Rogan believes that the chaos is such that a rebirth is necessary, and that's true. It's true. He's got that right, and he's in a good place to detect that, because Rogan is a upward aiming and straight shooting sort of character, and he's also talked and listened to, 2,000 expert people. So he's very informed. And it's not just Rogan. You can see this in other culture edge people. Ayaan Hirsi Ali converted to Christianity. So did her husband, Neil Ferguson. They were both...
From the University of Austin, correct?
Yes. They were both admirers of the horsemen of the atheist movement. They moved away from that. Ayaan recently had a debate with Dawkins on that very topic. And she told me, I just interviewed her, she told me that the resurgence of Christian faith saved her from some very dark times. And so Russell Brand is another example.
Amazing.
Douglas Murray has made similar statements. So has David Rubin. Who else?
By the way,
that'll do for the time being. So you can see this shift occurring.
What a performance by Doug Murray against Mehdi Hassan, right? I saw you tweeted that.
Yeah. Well,
at the monk debates, correct?
You have to be a fool indeed to accept an invitation to debate Douglas Murray.
It's suicide, right?
God. I mean, maybe Ben Shapiro could manage it.
Oh, yeah.
But, and perhaps Russell Brand. But
I'd pay money to watch that, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. No, so would I. I'd line up to watch that, for sure. Yeah. So, but then, Russell, for example, and Douglas would not be best suited for a debate. They would be best suited for a discussion because they would listen to each other and they would get somewhere.
For sure.
No, I mean, I just talked to Douglas 2 days ago. I happened to be in Toronto when he was there for the monk debates just before I came here.
Yep.
And they invited him back because he'd made such a hash out of
probably Israel
Blink.
versus Palestine.
No, it was the previous monk debate. He was debating the man who wrote Blink. What's his name? A famous novelist. Can't remember his name at the moment, but
We'll search and
Murray is very charismatic, and he's an unbelievably sharp-aimed debater. And so I guess I haven't watched it yet, but I know the outcome was that the vote of the audience, which is a very liberal audience, given that it's Canada, was radically in favor of Murray, as it was when he had engaged in the previous year's monk debate. So, good for him. Yeah. And Douglas is one of those people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali who have absolute spines of steel, right? They're really quite remarkable people.
they're definitely examples for us and very well regarded here in Brazil.
Well, and one of the things that's very compelling about their examples, and this is something for everyone to really understand, is that the conservative types will say to young people, it's your duty to tell the truth. You should tell the truth. They'll wag their fingers and moralize about it. But what the conservatives are good at conscience, but they're not very good at calling. And what they don't tell young people is that one of the reasons you should, the primary reason, perhaps a primary reason that you should tell the truth is because it's an incredibly adventurous thing to do. So when you look at the lives of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, and Douglas Murray, they're traveling all over the world. They occupy a central place and well-deserved on the public stage. They're very much worth listening to.
Yep.
Their lives are anything but dull. The reason for that is because they're telling the truth. The truth is an adventure. And
and people evermore they place a high premium and they reward whoever seems to be the truth teller in society.
Well, they might punish them to begin with. This is the cost, right?
But that's the cost. That's the cost.
But just because something has a price in the short term doesn't mean it's not a good long-term strategy. And the truth is, people lie to get things they don't deserve and to avoid consequences they do deserve. And lies work in the very short term, but the sacrifice that you engage in by lying is that you forego the adventure of your life. And so the promise in the Christian corpus is that the adventure that you would have by telling the truth is of sufficient depth to justify the suffering of life. And you kind of know this with your kids, because you want your kids to go out there and hit the target, right? To put everything they have behind it, to push the boulder uphill. And you have an intuition that they're at their best when they're doing that. That's what you want to celebrate when you see them on the sports field, for example, or in a competition in their class. You want to see them having that, thriving in that way and having that adventure. You have an intuition that if they only continued to do that properly, that they would have the lives they should have.
They would excel.
They'd excel, exactly, and that would be worth it. Well, so this is what happens in the story of Abraham. So Abraham, in some ways, he had a childhood like the one you described. He's the child of wealthy parents, and there's no evidence in the story that Abraham ever had to lift a finger. And God doesn't come to him till he's like 70. He's living in his father's tent. He has everything done for him. He has the socialist paradise at hand, right? He's a completely satiated infant. And God comes to him as the voice of adventure and says, you have to leave your zone of comfort and go out into the world. And it's quite a catastrophe because Abraham goes out in the world and the aristocrats conspire to steal his wife. He encounters starvation and tyranny. He ends up in a war, he ends up having to sacrifice his son. Like his life is a sequence of cataclysmic adventures. But he has enough faith and courage at the beginning to leave and to journey out in the world. And God makes him an offer. This is a very cool thing to understand because it speaks of a kind of alignment of instinct and destiny. So imagine that there's something in you that calls you to adventure. Okay, now the question would be, if you listened to that and made the necessary sacrifices to do that, and you did nothing else, right? You were religious in your observance of that. What would happen? Well, this is the offer that God makes Abraham. He says, 4 things will happen if you do this. You'll be a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, because many of us are often curses to ourselves because we're embarrassed about the way we conduct ourselves. So you'll be a blessing to yourself. That's a good deal. You'll be a blessing to yourself in a manner that will bring you renown that's deserved among your fellow men. So that's a good deal.
Of course. It stimulates you to keep moving forward.
Well, and it places you around friends and allies wherever you go.
Exactly.
And it's deserved.
Yeah.
So that's a good deal. That's a great deal. Okay, but that's not all. The third deal is that you'll do that in a way that will enable you to establish something of permanent value. So that's the dynasty in Abraham's case, because he's destined to become the father of nations. So he'll do something permanent, and this is the kicker, you'll do all of that in a way that's a blessing to everyone else. So then imagine, this is so cool. This is so cool if it's right. So imagine that there's an instinct to develop in children that you foster as a benevolent father. You encourage it. And then you could imagine that characterizes your child and they develop optimally. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means their spirits become integrated and line up. It means that that integrated spirit is now looked upon with admiration by other people, and they're a target of emulation. That both of those things happen in a way that's most likely to establish something permanent and lasting, and all of that happens in a way that's of benefit to everyone else. That's a good deal. That's the covenant that God establishes with Abraham in the biblical story.
There you go.
And I think, I can't see how that can possibly be wrong, because the alternative hypothesis is that the spirit of adventure that motivates children and adults to develop would make them a curse to themselves. No. Would decrease their value to others. No. Would make it impossible to establish something permanent. Well, that's foolish. Why would you have the instinct? And that would only take away from others. It's like, no, you know perfectly well, if you're on a sports team and you have the best player on your team who's also a good sport, then that player is a benefit to himself, and he's a gift to the team.
To the whole.
Right, yeah, absolutely, in a way that makes him and the team develop too.
For sure.
Right, exactly. So there's no zero sum.
I don't want to sound corny, but we always go back to there's no I in team, right?
Right, right.
There sort of is. I mean, the whole team is composed of different I's, I guess.
Right, but they're all, well,
they're
all playing a game.
Yep.
Right, well, that's the best. One of the things I came to understand in the last 2 years, took me a long time to figure this out, like 40 years, was that the spirit of play, so that would be what really unites a team. The spirit of play is the antithesis to tyranny. And so that team, the reason that there's no I isn't because the I's disappear. They don't. The I's are optimally integrated in the game. And you know this is true perfectly well. When a team is really functioning optimally together, when they're hot, everyone on the team is striving upward in a way that optimizes their own development. They're doing that in relationship to everyone else, and the whole team is getting better, right? And that's when it's fun. That's what's so cool. It's even fun to watch.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Don't take it from us. I mean, why don't we mention just recently the GOAT, Tom Brady? He said that without his teammates, he wouldn't have had not even close to the career that he was able to achieve.
Well, so
he's very grateful for that, and coming from him speaks volumes.
Yeah, should listen to it. That's right. Well, there's also something very interesting about that as well, which is that the success of Brady didn't detract from the success of his teammates. Quite the contrary, right? The more successful he was, the better off all his teammates were.
There you go.
That's the hallmark of a properly functioning society, and it's the antithesis to that zero-sum game that the apocalypse-mongering utopians are trying to foist on everyone, right? It's like, well, there's not enough to go around, and everyone's going to have to be restricted, and you're going to have to get used to having less. It's like, No,
No.
there's plenty to go around. If
For sure.
people function together properly, there would be, that's also a biblical promise. There's more than enough to go around if everyone aims upward, and I think that's right.
Dr. Peterson, this already is a wide-ranging discussion, but before we delve a little deeper, I cannot resist but share perhaps a lighter side to my career. Because in Brazil, I've become quite known for my talent in voice impressions, voice impersonations. And it's a curious claim to fame, for sure.
Yeah, it's a good one, though.
It's a good one.
It's a good one,
but,
yeah.
And if I may, with all, I mean, I don't want to sound pretentious here at all.
Well, if you're going to imitate me, you're going to sound pretentious.
We'll get there. But I believe that imitation touches, and I've done my own introspection on this subject matter.
Yeah.
It touches on fundamental issues like identity and self-recognition.
Yeah, definitely.
At some point in life, we've all grappled with that quintessential question: to be or not to be. That is the question. So, I mean, we invest so much into our own egos that when we see another person able to mimic us and emulate our gesticulations and our voices, it's almost like a theft that doesn't actually take nothing away.
Yeah.
That's sort of my take on it.
Yeah.
But
definitely.
I would love to hear.
That's why we imitate.
For sure. But I mean, at least from my studies, I believe it comes from way back into Aristotle's and the mimetic, the study of mimesis back in the day.
Yes, definitely.
So it really, I want to hear. I'm dying to hear your take on this from a psychological viewpoint. Why do these impressions captivate people so much and have captivated them throughout millennia?
Oh, no, I think you put your finger on it already.
Right.
Well, look, one of the things that really characterizes human beings, probably more than our capacity for language. First of all, language is a mimetic function. Well, we use the same words, right? So we're imitating. If you speak the same language as someone else, there's an imitation there because you share the same words, you share the same linguistic patterns. And so without the ability to imitate, there'd be no language. Imitation is more fundamental to the human mode of existence, even than language. And that's really saying something. And what we do when we're very sophisticated in our capacity to imitate, because if I watch you do something, I can copy it, which means I can learn what you know without paying the whole price that you paid. But then it's more than that. If you watch a child, for example, imitate his father in a game, say a game of house with a girl, he doesn't duplicate his father. He does something much more sophisticated, is he watches his father across many different situations, and he extracts out the central pattern of fatherhood, and then he imitates that and plays it, right? It's very sophisticated. And that's what the religious enterprise is to some degree, because we created well, imagine that people will tell each other interesting stories, right? Okay, so what that means is that there's a kind of story that's interesting and a kind of story that isn't. All right, so an interesting story, you could say an interesting story captures something that could and should be imitated. It's worth passing on. Okay, so now it's a distillation process. If I tell an interesting story about you, I don't describe everything you did. I describe something interesting you did that's worth imitating. Okay, so now imagine I'm a great novelist, and I can take a whole sequence of descriptions of interesting things, and I can abstract out of that the most interesting thing, which would also be the thing you should imitate most. Well, that's what happens in the development of religion. So Christ is portrayed in Christian tradition, for example, as the King of Kings. Okay, so what that means something. It's not just a declarative statement. What it means is something like this. Imagine that there are genuine kings of men. And I don't necessarily mean arbitrary political figures. I mean, there's an admirable sports figure, and there's an admirable leader, and there's an admirable musician, and there's an admirable plumber, and there's an admirable grandfather. And the thing that unites all of them is, so they're kings in their domain. The thing that unites all of them is that proclivity to be admirable. Okay, imagine now you extract that out as a central tendency. Okay, that's what is represented by the Passion of Christ. It's the pattern that makes the great kings great. And so what's the pattern? It's a weird inversion, because in the classical world, a great hero would be a dominant, high-status individual. Okay, and there's some truth in that, because it's better to be a dominant, high-status individual than a craven coward. And so you could get the military hero that way. But then you might say, well, is the military hero the highest form of admirable? And the answer would be no, because there's an obvious flaw in the military hero, which is the necessity of death, let's say. What might be the heroic pattern that's higher than that? Well, that's what's attempting to be portrayed in the Christian passion. It's the willingness to take on the whole burden of existence and to make the most dramatic possible sacrifice in the service of the highest goal. And that is, so the Christian calling is to, it's not to belief in Christ. That's not right. Not like a declarative statement. It's a call to imitation. So what do you imitate? What's the imitation of Christ? So what is that? It's the imitation of that ultimate self-sacrificial pattern that the community is necessarily founded on, right? So that's how, so why do we like impressions? Well, because it's a celebration of imitation, right? And, and imitation is...
It's an homage. It's sort of an,
absolutely.
It's sort of an homage.
And it's a demonstration of that talent.
Yes, it is, for sure.
Right.
I've been trying to lay down my own impression of you. It's been bloody hard. I have this proclivity to try and integrate the different hierarchical substructures and to not sound like Kermit the Frog. It's pretty damn hard. Come on, Jordan. How dare this whippersnapper come here, this little smart alecky who looks like Ken doll, to try and imitate us? Come on, that's pretty. How do I can't even put my hands on it. Come on.
Yeah,
Jordan,
that's good. That's good. It's so funny when people imitate me. I can hear my accent.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Very funny.
I'm bloody wrong. Clean your bloody room.
So when you do that,
yes,
when you're practicing to do that,
would you mind if I talk to you and try to
it'll be very
my own voice with
it'll
you?
be very distracting. When you do that, do you have to adopt the posture? Yeah, you do. You have to, and the face.
Yeah.
Now you're going to make me turn all red here. How terrible. Yeah.
Well, it's an homage.
Now I'm sweating.
For sure.
You shouldn't sweat.
Yeah.
Come on.
But anyways, I'm still trying to... I can't believe this.
It was
just
pretty
happened.
Good. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep modulating and trying to find the best version. Well, send my best to Tammy, if you will.
All right. I can't believe I got this out. What grade do I get? A
Very
B?
funny.
A B is fine?
It was pretty good.
Pretty good. A minus?
Sure.
All right, then.
Sure.
An A minus from Dr.
Good to
Peterson.
have some room for improvement, just so you have something else to do.
That's definitely
What else?
for sure.
What other voices can you do?
Well, Donald Trump is here. Dr. Peterson's so great. I mean, he called me a viper. I mean, I'm the biggest viper ever. I have the biggest fangs. And, I mean, we're going to make psychology great again. You take a look at Biden, he's a total lunatic. He's a nut job. He can barely get 2 sentences out, Dr. Peterson. So, I mean, we're going to have such a great debate performance. Do you have any suggestions for me, perhaps?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Any debate suggestions? Biden can barely talk. He looks like a mummy. Little mummy. He's petrified. He's going to go down the tubes. Believe me.
Well, come on, Jordan. I need President Biden here. We got to cut the malarkey. By the way, where the hell am I? What's this place all about? You have any suggestions? Because I want to take down this goddamn fascist that's one that kills democracy in the United States. How about my age? Come on, folks. Number one, my age. Do you think that'll be an issue for Americans? That's an actual question. Did the cat bite your tongue out?
That's great. So what I see when you're doing that, it's so interesting to watch. Hey,
it's. I mean, there are different dimensions to it, I guess. Gesticulations, facial, manual, vocal, for sure. So it's a construction. I want to hear your take on it. I'm here to hear what did you decipher from
I've watched great musicians, and when I watch, especially guitar players, I can see them. I can see the musicians they've listened to flit across their face while they're playing. And that So that's what you're doing when you're imitating, is you're playing. Mm-hmm. So here's what happens to kids when they're playing. This is very interesting. So imagine that we have a great realm of potential that can be investigated, that's encoded in our genetic heritage. Mm-hmm. And that can make itself manifest in many different ways. So you could torture a child into becoming a criminal, for example, or you could encourage them into becoming someone good. There's a big range of possibility. When a child plays, which is exactly what you were doing, when a child plays, they experiment with different forms of being, and that they embody that so deeply. There's a way of thinking about that. Mm-hmm. They're embodying a spirit that's a neurological and muscular pattern. And if they practice that, that's going to produce a transformation that's so deep, it's even going to extend down to the genetic level. And when a child's playing, he's playing with all the possibilities that he could become, and practicing becoming one of those. And part of the reason it's fascinating to watch someone imitate the way you did is because it's like watching someone turn back into a child. Right, because you're playing.
You're calling me a little child? You have 12 rules, I got 13 rules. They're better rules, I mean, they're even better. You're calling me a little child? By the way, if I get this segue here, you even called Trump, in a way, his bully tactics, even childlike.
Oh, yeah. He's very good at that. Oh, well, yeah. I have this funny book. It's very funny. It's a library-bound edition that's called The Collected Poetry of Donald Trump. And it's all his tweets typeset very beautifully and put in this quite lovely volume. And it's insanely comical. He has an insanely good sense of humor. It's very pointed. But he does have that. I did a pretty careful study of bullies when I was a kid because I was small. I was the youngest person in my class. And I was small for my age as well. And so that made me a pretty good target for the bullies. And I learned in part to defend myself against that verbally. But I also studied the bullies to figure out what they were up to. And Trump is a very, very good bully. About 13 years old in that regard. And it's also not an insult, because I've talked to people who've known him on the foreign policy front, for example.
It makes him unpredictable, right?
It does. Well, it's also the case that if you're on the world stage, and you're dealing with the pathological rulers of pathological states, the probability that you're going to be dealing with bullies is 100%. And Trump actually knows how to do that. And so it makes him unpredictable, and it adds an element of kind of adolescent
tactics, or
it's hard for me to get it right, because it's a limitation in a way, and that's partly what makes Trump such a divisive figure, because people respond with aversion to that bullying element of his character. But it's hard to criticize it too deeply, because it's also arguably what makes him an extremely effective debater, and also possibly capable of making peace on the international stage.
Oh yeah, I mean,
because people don't know what the hell he's going to do.
But facts are stubborn things.
Yeah.
The record is set. And Americans will have a very clear choice between the Trump years and the last 41 months of Biden.
Yeah, no wars during the Trump years.
Let's see what I mean, I don't want to put you on a spot here into the political prognostication realm, but are you ready to make a prediction of sorts, or you won't go that far?
I think the Democrats will dump Biden at the convention. Right? Yeah, I think so.
I think that the debate that was anticipated is sort of his last chance, perhaps.
Maybe. I mean, who knows, right? Because the future is unpredictable.
As Trump would say, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens, Doc. But anyways, how about we go back and do a stroll down back memory lane on your part. And if you could have a conversation with a young Jordan Peterson, and he's over there back at the heart of the mighty Peace region in Fairview, northern Alberta, Canada. He's 18, 19, still... I mean, he's guiding the steering wheels of life. He has the pebbles and the boulders in his shoes. What advice would you give him?
Well, my wife and I have talked about this a fair bit, and one of the things I've known her since she was 8, literally since she was 8, so 60 years? No, she's not 68. Now I'm in real trouble. 55 years, a long time. And it would have been better had we got married earlier. Now,
You tried a lot, by the way. Weren't you insistent? But
not insistent enough.
all right.
Or not effectively insistent.
What does
or
that
not
mean?
committed enough. Well, the first time I asked her to marry me, I think I was 23. And I was still either more interested in or unable to get past the kind of the intense social life I had with my friends and the partying that went along with that. I mean, heavy drinking was an art form in northern Alberta, that's for sure, and I was a master of that art form.
All right.
And so
You no longer drink, right?
no, I haven't.
Not at
I
all.
really haven't drank since I was 27. I quit. I started again briefly when I was 50, when my kids left home, because I thought I could probably take a drink now and then.
But
and so,
pardon my pardon my interruption.
Yeah.
No, just I mean, many subjects here. Talking back to the original younger version of yourself.
Yeah.
Your marriage. You were talking about your marriage, correct?
yes, yes. Well, the advice would have been, it would have been better to get married to Tammy earlier. But I would have had to. And why didn't that happen? I didn't mature fast enough.
Yep.
So did she? Probably. If I would have had my act together when I was 23, she probably would have married me then. So, and why is that a problem? Well, if you love someone, why wouldn't you want to spend the best part of your youth
Oh yeah.
with them? And so, now she was a little older than me because she was in my class, and so I had to play some catch up on the maturation front, and women mature faster than men, and so that also complicated it. But I had some characterological inadequacies that might have been rectified earlier, and then maybe we would have had more kids too, which would have been good, because we have 2 kids, and that's okay. And I have 4 grandkids now, but both her and I agree that had we started earlier, we would have had more kids.
So my bad. I only mentioned Scarlett and Elliot.
Yeah, well,
What were the
there's,
other ones?
Shirley,
Shirley.
another son, a daughter of my son, and George, who's the newest one, who is my daughter Michaela's newest child. And
All right. So, Dr. Peterson, as we move to the end of this fascinating conversation, when I was digging through your vast body of work in preparation for this interview, I came across the famous letter you wrote to your father back in November 1986. You were just 25 by then, if I'm not mistaken. And there you spell out very clearly your political disillusionment that you were feeling at the time, particularly. And you wrote then, and I quote, "I looked for what I wanted to find where it was obvious to everyone it would be, in politics and in political science, in the study of group behavior. This took up the years I spent involved with the NDP, which is the major center-left party in Canada, and in studying political science until I learned that the application of a system of thought I like socialism, or any other ism for that matter, to a problem and solving that problem were not the same thing. In the former case, you have someone who is not you to blame, the rich, the Americans, the white people, the government, the system, whatever, as long as it is someone else." So my question is, your skepticism to the mundane reality of politics, which perhaps brings out the worst in you in order to make concessions and agreements that are disaligned with your own ideas for the world. This early realization that you had, very, impulsed by Orwell, your studies of Orwell, in blaming external entities for, which doesn't equate to actually solving the issues. My question is, has this political disillusionment followed you your whole life, or is there any conceivable scenario you would considering a run for perhaps Canadian Prime Minister? Because I'm sure you have a hell of a lot of
I
hopes.
wouldn't say it's disillusionment exactly.
So please correct the record.
Because it's not appropriate to be cynically disillusioned with politics. And the reason for that is, well, it's the classic gospel conception. You have to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And Caesar's part has its role. And so does God's. And I was struggling with that when I wrote that letter. What I came to understand was that the issues that most deeply concerned me weren't political. They were spiritual or psychological. Psychological first, say, then spiritual above that.
Yep.
And so I was looking for a spiritual solution, so to speak, in the political. And that was inappropriate. And I came to realize that as I continued to study and then moved into clinical psychology and then beyond that, let's say. So what's the upshot of that? That doesn't mean that the political has no point and no purpose. And it doesn't mean that you're allowed to be counterproductively cynical about the political. Okay, now you ask me a more concrete question. Would I ever consider a run at a political position?
I'm sure you've
I've considered it continually, and every time I've considered it, I've decided that what I was already doing was more useful than what I could do on that front, and that hasn't changed. And so I talk to political figures constantly, and I consider political matters, but that isn't my primary focus of concern, and it shouldn't be. In fact, I can tell too, in even practically speaking, when I become too political, when I'm tempted, let's say, to become too political, then the effectiveness of what I'm doing wanes rapidly. That isn't why people are interested in the things that I'm studying. And that's not primarily why I'm interested in them. I'm interested in, well, I was interested right from the beginning in the problem of evil. And I thought for a while that that was a political problem. And there are political manifestations of evil, obviously, but evil is not a political problem. It's a metaphysical problem. It's a theological problem. It's a spiritual problem. And it's an individual problem. And, you know, the antithesis to that finding fault in the place of others, the group, the Americans, the white people, let's say, the privileged, the powerful, that's an abdication of a certain kind of deep responsibility. So Christ as the Savior is the man who takes the sins of the world upon himself. Okay, and so what does that mean? Well, Dostoevsky figured this out. He understood very clearly that that's what people are called upon to do. What's the problem with the world? Fundamentally, you're not everything you could be. That's the problem, truly. And until you sort that out, you should leave other people the hell alone. Now, that doesn't mean you're not called upon to protect your family or any of those things, but it's what Christ is referring to in the Gospels when he tells people to take the dust speck out of their eye. No, the log out of their eye, the beam out of their eye, instead of being concerned with the dust speck in their enemy's eye. And see, the battle between good and evil in the Judeo-Christian conception is transformed into something that's played out on the public stage into a drama that plays out in the heart. And so you constrain evil in the world most effectively. It's the only way of doing it, by constraining its expression in your own soul. And you do that locally, like you do that by putting into order the relationship that you have with yourself, with your wife, with your children, with your parents, with your neighbors. That's where you do it. And it's pride that stops people from doing it, because they think that they want to play a dramatic role on the public stage, and they despise the opportunities to establish order that are right at hand. And you might say, well, my family's so screwed up that nothing I could do would help. And I would say, what that fundamentally indicates is that you have a lot to learn and that you have a lot of opportunity in front of you on that front. It doesn't mean it'll be easy, but that's still the proper domain of concern. And the world is constituted so that people don't understand this, but it's true. All the possibility that there is right in front of you. That's literally the case. It's a very daunting thing to understand. And that's true for everyone. And you think, well, there are these people of privilege and power who have far more opportunity than I do. It's like Christ is born in a manger for a reason. Right? And the reason is that you have the world. You don't know this, but you have the world at your fingertips. And part of what that means is that what you do matters. The local things you do matter way more than you think. And that's a really positive message, because it means that I don't have any more opportunity for adventure than you have. And that's the same for everyone you meet. And so that's a world of abundance, that's for sure. Infinite adventure for everyone. That's the central nature of the world, truly. And it's right there. You might be too blind to see it. That's what Christ says too. The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but men will not see it.
Right? All right. And I mean, we're short on time, Dr. Peterson, but I'm going to go for a final question here, perhaps a little multi-pronged, but I couldn't help myself but ask you this final question, because you draw extensively on the hero archetype, and with perhaps mirroring characters like Moses and Jonah, which I'm sure you mentioned on your upcoming book. A lot of young people, I'm only 29, and I see this as a communicator myself these days. The crisis in terms of free speech in Brazil is quite deep and unsettling, like it is in North America. And with voices perhaps like yours and many in Brazil who are facing suppression and cancellation, the disillusionment, the nihilism, the despair, the lack of moral and heroic references for young people these days. We're talking about what you've once called milquetoast leadership coming from above, with figures like Trudeau, who you've called a sanctimonious twerp at one point, and the Jacinda Ardens of the world, the Emmanuel Macrons of the world, the Joe Bidens of the world, if you will. I mean, based on all of that, what are the attributes of a hero that you think are most lacking in contemporary leaders, and who should young men look for guidance for them to turn from the what I would call the surfer boys of today into the lumberjacks of tomorrow?
Well, I would say, so Christ says in the Gospels, he says something like, I am the truth and the way and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Okay, so what does that mean, to come to the Father? It means to grow up. It means to mature.
Yep.
Okay, how do you do that? By sacrificing your idiot self, your idiot, immature self. How do you do that? By finding your way, by seeking, right? Knock and the door will open. Seek, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. That's the way, and you have to want that, to seek, and you can find that. How do you ensure that the way that you find is the proper way? You ensure that by doing everything you can to live in the truth, because otherwise you can't rely on yourself as a wayfinder. And so, and the simplest of all those, I would say, is likely to seek the truth. And the simplest way to do that is to start to stop the lying. And this is, I think, something that's there for everyone. You may not know how to tell the truth, because who knows how to tell the truth? But you do know that there are some times when you act falsely or you lie. You could stop that. Everyone can stop that. And what happens, that's how you get the beam out of your eye. You remove a lie and you can see a little more clearly, and then you see another one to remove and you can see a little more clearly, and that will illuminate the way, and that will bring you to the Father. That's how life works. That's the truth. So, and to top it off, there isn't anything that you can do that's more exciting than that. And there isn't anything you can do, and this is a good thing for young men to know, young women too, there's nothing you can do that will make you more attractive to other people than that. And so if you're looking for a mate, which you are, obviously, then that's the thing to do. And because that'll make the best out of you. You know, people say you should be yourself. And that's often twisted in a kind of hedonistic way. You should just do what you want to do. If you were your deepest self, if you were truly your deepest self, people would be lining up to play with you. Right, right.
So, Dr. Peterson, as we wrap up, I must confess, part of today's challenge was restraining myself from being just a fan in your presence. And, I mean, your work has not only enlightened, but also guided many, myself included, through the complexities of life, and I'm immensely, immensely grateful for this opportunity to discuss these profound topics with you. It's been a true privilege, and I hope our paths cross again. So thank you so very much for sharing your insights. I hope Brazil treats you well and steering this conversation with such grace. I truly hope our paths can cross again. And please continue inspiring the world, my friend.
Well, thank you. So that was a good game.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. Yeah, and for the invitation as well. And to all of you watching and listening for the time and attention.
A final message to your Brazilian fans?
message to my Brazilian fans?
I'll give you a final component here. There's this, in Brazil, there's this generation called neither nor generation.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about millions of young people, millions, who neither work nor study.
Yeah.
They're known as the geração nem nem.
Okay, that's good.
The geração.
Well, I can tell you,
nem,
I can
the
say
nem,
something
generation.
about that.
So, a message to them.
When Christ comes back at the end of time as the judge, as the eternal judge who separates the sheep from the goats, the penalty that's most severe is restricted to those who sit on the fence, who are neither for or against, who play both ends against the middle. And so it's better to commit, even if you commit to something that turns out to be wrong, at least you will learn what wrong is as a consequence of the commitment. If you fail to decide and stay stagnant, you lose in every possible way. And that will make you bitter, and that will make you cruel, and then things will get worse. So neither here nor there, that's limbo, that's purgatory, and then it's hell. That's a bad idea. So find a purpose, pick something, commit to it, right? And put your house in order around that commitment. And that'll please the ultimate judge of being, and that's probably a good thing for you.
Strong words from an incredibly strong voice. No one could have said it better. Doctor, thank you so much, my friend. Thank you so much.
Jovem Pan Morning Show.